All right, let's talk about Venezuela. For years, the official story coming out of Washington has been all about drugs. You've heard it. The narrative painted Venezuela under President Nicolas Maduro as a narco state, a key player in flooding the world with illegal substances. The U.S. government spent years imposing sanctions, indicting officials, and running naval operations, all under the noble banner of a war on drugs. They insisted their only goal was to dismantle criminal networks and bring justice to those who profit from addiction and misery. It's a simple, heroic tale. America, the global cop, cleaning up a dangerous neighborhood. It sounds almost believable, if you ignore absolutely everything else that's happened. The climax of this supposed drug bust came on January 3rd, 2026. U.S. Special Forces, in a dramatic and deadly raid on Caracas, captured President Maduro himself. It was a massive operation, involving over 150 aircraft, a clear demonstration of overwhelming military force. Maduro was promptly flown to New York to face charges from a 2020 indictment related to narco-terrorism. On the surface, it looked like the final chapter of a long-running crime drama. The bad guy was in cuffs, and the credits were ready to roll. The U.S. had apparently won its righteous crusade, and the world was meant to applaud the takedown of a supposed kingpin. But here's where the story starts to unravel, like a cheap sweater snagged on a geopolitical fact. Experts have consistently pointed out that Venezuela's role in the global drug trade is, to put it mildly, overstated. Yes, it's a transit country for cocaine, but most of that product is heading to Europe, not the U.S. And when it comes to the fentanyl crisis ravaging America, Venezuela is barely a footnote. So if this was all about drugs, it was a bit like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut that wasn't even in the same room. The justification felt disproportionate, the target slightly off-center. It's almost as if the stated reason wasn't the real reason. Suddenly, just as the world was processing the capture, the script changed entirely. The war on drugs narrative, which had been the headline for years, was unceremoniously dropped. It was like a magician distracting you with one hand while the other was doing something far more interesting. The moment Maduro was on a plane, the conversation in Washington pivoted with breathtaking speed from cocaine to crude oil. The mission wasn't over. In fact, it seemed the main event was just beginning. The focus shifted from courtrooms and evidence lockers to oil fields and investment contracts, leaving everyone to wonder what this operation was really about all along. So, with Maduro out of the picture, what was the very next move from the U.S. administration? Was it a plan to rebuild democratic institutions? A humanitarian aid package? Nope. It was a full-throated declaration of economic intent. President Trump announced that the U.S. would effectively run the country and seize its oil infrastructure. He didn't mince words, stating that very large U.S. oil companies were being invited to invest, and that the whole military adventure won't cost us a penny. Why? Because it would all be paid for with money coming out of the ground. It was less a foreign policy statement and more a pitch from a spectacularly aggressive venture capitalist. The administration immediately began making good on that promise. Behind the scenes, messages were flying to American oil giants, basically telling them it was a gold rush. The offer was simple: go into Venezuela, invest in rebuilding the dilapidated oil sector, and you can reclaim assets that were seized from you decades ago. It was a get-in now if you want to play scenario, backed by the full might of the U.S. military. Meetings were set up between the president, his energy secretary, and oil executives. This wasn't a subtle hint. It was a formal invitation to a corporate takeover underwritten by the American taxpayer. And why the rush? Because Venezuela is sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves. We're talking over 300 billion barrels. That's more than Saudi Arabia. It is the single biggest prize in the global energy lottery. Granted, decades of corruption and mismanagement have left the country's oil infrastructure in a state of near total collapse, with production at a fraction of its former peak. The oil is also mostly heavy crude, which requires special refineries. But for a nation with the right technology and a sudden, overwhelming military presence, that decaying infrastructure doesn't look like a problem. It looks like a massive, discounted business opportunity. To make the point crystal clear, the US then announced Venezuela would be handing over up to 50 million barrels of crude oil worth billions of dollars, with no clear mention of compensation. This was framed as a down payment for the US-led reconstruction effort, enforced by the threat of a naval blockade. This isn't diplomacy, it's a shakedown. The narrative had shifted completely from fighting drug lords to exploiting natural resources. It's hard to argue you're there to fight crime when you're busy stuffing your pockets with the country's most valuable asset. The mask had not just slipped, it had been thrown on the ground and stomped on. This sudden, intense focus on Venezuelan oil isn't happening in a vacuum. It's directly linked to growing anxieties back home in the United States. America's own energy landscape is changing. Domestic shale oil output, once the backbone of a fracking boom, is showing signs of decline. At the same time, environmental policies have led to the shutdown and defunding of refineries and pipelines in several states, particularly on the West Coast. The result is a looming gap between what the U.S. produces and what it consumes. A superpower needs fuel to run, and the fuel gauge was starting to look a little worrying. Enter Venezuela's heavy crude. As it happens, U.S. refineries along the Gulf Coast are perfectly suited to process it. Between 1990 and 2010, these facilities invested a staggering $100 billion to specialize in handling exactly this type of oil. For years, politics got in the way, but the hardware has been sitting there, ready and waiting. Securing a direct, cheap, and massive supply of Venezuelan crude isn't just a good business move for oil companies. It's a strategic solution to America's domestic energy security puzzle. It's like finding the one missing puzzle piece you desperately need and realizing it's in your neighbor's house and you have a very large army. This move also has a geopolitical dimension, particularly concerning China and Russia. China has become a major customer for Venezuelan oil and a key financial backer of the anemic Venezuelan state. By taking control of the oil supply, the U.S. not only secures its own energy needs, but also cuts a rival superpower off at the knees. It's a classic two-for-one deal. Similarly, the U.S. naval blockade has already created tense standoffs with Russian tankers as Moscow tries to protect its own interests in the region. This isn't just about oil. It's about reasserting American dominance in its own hemisphere and pushing back against global competitors. All of this context makes the war on drugs story look even more flimsy. The timing is just too perfect. The moment U.S. domestic energy concerns reach a critical point, a massive military operation, justified on shaky grounds, unlocks the world's largest oil reserve, which just so happens to be perfectly compatible with U.S. infrastructure. It's a coincidence of such magnificent proportions that it stops being a coincidence and starts looking like a meticulously planned agenda. The problem wasn't drugs flowing out of Venezuela. It was oil not flowing into the United States. So, what are we left with? On one hand, we have the official story, a heroic mission to capture a narco-dictator. On the other hand, we have an immediate pivot to seizing the country's oil, a fire sale for U.S. companies, a solution for America's energy anxieties, and a strategic power play against China and Russia. When the stated reason for an action explains almost none of the subsequent behavior, it's probably not the real reason. This wasn't a drug bust that luckily stumbled upon an oil field. This was an operation to secure an oil field that was conveniently packaged as a drug bust. The reaction from the rest of the world has been exactly what you'd expect. Widespread condemnation. Allies and adversaries alike, from Brazil and Mexico to Russia and China, have called it what it is, an imperial oil grab. The United Nations and the Organization of American States have voiced their alarm. Even at home, the move has been criticized by politicians on both sides of the aisle. who see uncomfortable parallels to the 2003 invasion of Iraq and its infamous weapons of mass destruction. When your foreign policy reminds people of the Iraq invasion, you have, to put it mildly, made a significant misstep. Meanwhile, inside Venezuela, the government that remains has sworn in a new leader and vowed to resist what it calls an unprecedented military aggression. They have militarized their own oil facilities, setting the stage for a protracted and dangerous conflict. The Venezuelan people, already suffering under years of economic collapse, are now caught in the middle of a geopolitical tug-of-war between a superpower determined to take their resources and a government determined to hold on to them. Their future is being decided not by ballots, but by barrels of oil and the threat of military force. Ultimately, the evidence points overwhelmingly in one direction. The primary motivator for the U.S. intervention in Venezuela was not justice, democracy, or even drugs. It was oil, a vast, untapped ocean of it, located conveniently in America's backyard. The operation was a cold, calculated move to secure a critical resource for the 21st century. It's a stark reminder that in the great game of geopolitics, high-minded ideals are often just a cover for the relentless pursuit of national interest. Thank you so much for reading. For more deep dives that will probably ruin your faith in powerful institutions, please keep visiting our publication. And let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear them.